of Icebound, the interactive ARG that we showed earlier. And panel is the future of truly interactive story. And guys, thanks for coming on the Digicon.
Yeah, definitely. We're excited. This is an awesome event. So
I'm super excited. Like this game blew my mind, and even before you
I,
guys had video of it, and once you
I'm a
guys showed,
little
it's so
I'm a
cool.
little bummed because I went to IndieCade East, and your game was part of of the exhibit upstairs, but the iPad was frozen that it was on, and no, I
yeah,
kept trying to find someone to fix it. Everyone's like, oh,
yeah. We got it. So we got invited to. We were at IndieCade West or IndieCade Prime or whatever it's called
That's where I met you
in
guys.
LA. And we were able to come down to that, but we basically just couldn't afford to make it to IndieCade East, even though they invited us. So we sort of sent instructions, and but we realized, I mean, it's a complicated enough thing. We're like, yeah, it's probably gonna something's gonna go wrong in 45 minutes, and then the rest of the weekend, it'll be, who knows. But it was awesome that they invited us to be at that one too.
awesome. Well, we've got about 10 minutes before we need to get started. Anyone has questions about Icebound, get them ready now. And
Yeah.
but they'll also be, so maybe they'll answer them during their
And this is
presentation or
the
at the
same
end. So,
Icebound that we were talking about when we were exhibiting games today and
yes.
yesterday. So you've already seen some footage, you already heard our opinions, and now you get to.
Oh, we were talking about you guys at some point. We weren't sure if you were actually developing for non-game type of things, like with that technology, but we thought it would be super cool to use in education because imagine like an interactive history book. You know what I mean?
Yeah, yeah. The our focus is finishing the game right now, but there
Yeah.
are definitely things we would like to do with the tech behind it
Definitely.
after that. So yeah.
Are you guys in a Scandinavian metal band? Asks Evil Dog.
Icebound.
Yeah. Hey, that could work.
Yeah, we've always tossed around the idea too of having like an '80s like ballad style outro for Icebound at the end with the credits rolling. So
Thematically,
it's important to end on the right note.
Yeah. Oh shit.
And since we're in between segments, just a reminder to everyone, thanks to our sponsors, Indie Box and Indie Game Stand. Go check them out at some point, either quickly now before the panel starts or after. And we also have a donate button if you want to support IRX, or merch if you want a shirt. There's rules and the schedule in case you are looking for that kind of information. And, of course, the contest for 15 games, 15 indie games being featured over IRX. That's a lot of games for just clicking a few buttons. And there's one of the... send another wave of hashtag IRX15 throughout the internet.
That's what I'm going to be doing right now, actually.
Okay. Well, with that out of the way, are you guys okay with starting 9 minutes early?
Yeah, I think so. Sure.
All right.
Okay.
All right.
We will turn it over to you guys. Have fun.
Cool. Excellent. Yeah. So we were thinking about what might be fun to talk about, and obviously one of the sort of standout points of Icebound is just doing kind of different things with story in games. So we thought it might be fun to talk about some of like the directions that we see story moving in the future, and also a lot of cool things that are going on right now, and how those are sort of maybe shaping what's going to come. Yeah, and I guess you guys just talked about Icebound, but maybe for people just tuning in now, we'll just give a quick overview of how the story part of that works. Kind of the core idea behind the game side. So Icebound, in the broad sense, is a game that involves both the printed book and then an app that you run either on a tablet or on a PC with a webcam. And it uses augmented reality to sort of recognize what page of the book you're looking at, and use that to sort of shape the story as it's going on as you're playing. And so the way that works from a story perspective is most of the gameplay is taking all of these fragments of story, and the premise is that there's this sort of unfinished book that you're helping this AI complete. You have all these story fragments, and there's a narrative engine that understands how all of those fragments, the different ways they might fit together. So fragments can have sort of preconditions. So you might have a fragment that's about two characters having an argument, for example. Those might not be preset characters. It might be any two characters, but there might be a precondition that someone has to have done something threatening, for example, before that fragment can be pulled into the story. So the analogy we like, and I think we might have talked about this when we were on the show a couple months ago, was sort of like narrative Legos. So you have, rather than a branching path structure with all of the sort of connections predetermined, you have all of these pieces, and the system understands for each type of piece the ways it can connect to other pieces, and how using that piece sort of changes the story. I think we might have lost the connection. Are you guys still there?
Yes, we are. It seems that you may need to update Skype, unfortunately.
Okay. Let's see here.
Luckily, we are running a little bit early, so so some of these hitches will be fine. Josh, are you still there?
Yeah. Can you hear us?
All right.
I'm here. Everything is audio, but someone's Skype hasn't been updated, which is why.
Aaron, I believe you may have to update Skype. Oh, wait, here you are.
Okay.
It's very dark, but I think we can work with it.
It just like randomly turned off the button and said you need to join a video call. So we clicked the button again, and now we're back. So
yeah,
it's gonna stay dark until someone updates.
Should we try that real quick, you think?
Yeah, go ahead and
yeah.
restart Skype.
We'll stall for time. Everything's fine. We are running early,
Sorry.
which is perfect.
Okay, we'll be right back.
All right. So they are coming right back. Sorry for the small, technical issues. Things like that definitely happen. I'm going to take video off right now, just to make it a little bit, not have things look really strange for the people at home. For the question about updating Skype, we are running this through Skype calls, and Skype used to not allow video calls with more than two people without premium. However,
so
they
if
changed that.
If they have an old version of Skype, it still does that, so they need to restart it,
and it'll update.
Yeah.
And we found that out the hard way. One time that was with Jerry. That was really recently, wasn't it?
Yeah.
Yeah. So, yeah, it's annoying, but things happen, and all things considered, for a technical problem, that is not the worst one to have. So, thank you guys for hanging in there with us. Really?
Yeah. I don't know. Skype's pretty stupid when it comes to this stuff. It's weird, but
if there was a better program to use with this.
We were thinking Mumble, but that also costs money, and
it doesn't have video.
Don't have money, and it doesn't have video. Yeah. Right.
So someone work on a way to get people in through Skype or a Skype-like program and then stream them. I don't think it exists because you hear all these radio stations using Skype, and you see all these news.
Unless it's Rev who has on a different computer, maybe that has an older version.
I don't,
because they said that they had the latest version.
Oh, did they? Hey, Rev. But Rev wasn't killing it for Jay.
Yeah, but it just randomly does it when it feels like it, I guess.
That's true. So when they hop back in, it seems like my video isn't working either. Josh, is your video working? Turn your video on.
I see myself.
All right, and Rev stepped away for a moment, so he is completely out of the loop. We actually lost Rev.
I hung up on him.
Oh, okay, cool.
I'll just invite Aaron back in, I guess.
Yes. Is he back in?
I can do it. It's fine.
Okay.
For some reason, we still have Jay. Let me.
Oh yeah, let's kick him out.
Screw that guy.
Yeah. Also, we'll be getting updates. I bet he is listening. So.
Jay, get out of this group. I don't know why it's not letting me do it.
Yeah, Danny, that could work. The problem is audio quality as well. Going through the going through like a website based thing, getting webcams to resize and having a quality be good instead of just having it stream directly to the person who's running the broadcasting software. In this case, me, is just quality issues. So again, we apologize. We might end up just restarting everything because actually, chat.
I can't. It won't let me get Jay out of the group. I fucking hate Skype. I really do.
Yeah.
I wish there was a better program.
Conversation. Oh well. Rev, are you back? You're almost back. We can't hear you if you are. Now we can hear you.
Okay, sorry about that.
Did you?
All right, give me. I'm gonna actually hang up this call, and
We're
just
gonna-
do a new one. All right.
Okay, so everybody stand by. Josh's voice and Rev's voice are going to disappear for a quick little second. So you guys get to hear me talk and ramble on and try to keep things interesting for the time being, because that's just how things roll. Again, sorry about these technical problems. We will, as far as technical problems go, they are not that bad, and everything will be figured out very shortly. Thank you for your patience. Thank you for showing up. I know we mentioned this before, but check out the buttons underneath the stream. Just scroll. Just put your mouse over the video and scroll. You can check out IndieBox or Indie Game Stand. Both of those are awesome companies that we definitely support and help support us as well. Those are affiliate links. So if you click on those and you buy something, we get a little kickback. You can also check out the merch, which is somewhat of a limited edition deal because by next year the logo is going to change. It's going to be new, and those will be collector's items probably. And if you haven't already, make sure that you click to possibly win the Indie Game Mega Pack that we are going to be giving away. 15 games. Currently, there are only 127 entries. There's a pretty good chance you could win all of these awesome games, including The Architect, Save the Robots, Mondrian Abstraction and Beauty, Skyhook, Bourgeois Speedrunners, Vidar, Dr. Space Zoo, Serious Online, Not Without My Donuts, Vortex Attack, Cool Dog Don't Care, Quantum Pilot, Adventures in Equica, Unicorn Training, and Panmorphia, sorry about that, and Alpha Star. Those are the games that you can win if you enter from that button. If you just scroll down, it's the big contest button that you guys can click. I can put this video in the meantime. This isn't of that GIF from last night, is it? Should I regret clicking this? I'm not going to play that. Just for the copyrighted ness of everything. I'm going to make sure to also ask in Skype, how are things going with you? So, I guess I'll get some music on in here. I don't really know what to play. I've got a lot of cool, like, epic-sounding music, like, if my hard drive wants to work. Apparently, I am... Oh. I didn't know that this was a new call.
Yes.
And I'm on Do Not Disturb, so I've been trying to fill time.
So, I'm sitting here like tech.
No, like, I'm on Do Not Disturb. I'm a professional.
We message you on like 10 different things.
I was trying to keep the people entertained, guys.
Well, everything's good to go now.
Everything's good to go. You guys could. Do you want to restart? You want to just pick up where you last left off?
Yeah, just pick up where you left off and.
All right.
Sure. Yeah, that's no problem. And I mean,
right.
yeah, it's
away.
9 right now, so we're fine.
Perfect.
Cool. Right. So Icebound uses narrative Legos. I think is what the point we were trying to make. Yeah. So So I guess there are a lot of really interesting things that can come out of this technique. Hopefully, some of them will be evidence when you play Icebound. So one of the really interesting things, we both kind of have an interesting background because we come into game design from being writers. So uh, and I've worked on a lot of different kinds of interactive story projects on various levels and using different kinds of technology since I've started doing this. But one of the things with this project that I think is really interesting is that it's pretty rare in an interactive story for some story outcome you can get to surprise the writer, because usually either all of the sort of outcomes are predetermined, or especially as you get into more mainstream games, the what system for combining stuff there is isn't complicated enough to do something that'll really surprise the writer. So we were going to talk maybe about Shadows of Mordor lately as one of like the few examples of something that's maybe starting to challenge that assumption. But traditionally, at least, that's extremely rare. But one of the cool things about the sort of Lego approach is that it's pretty easy actually to get into a situation where someone with Icebound, for instance, can make a story that we had never particularly thought of that story before. So again, there's kind of an analogous question of like, how many Legos do you need to give someone before they can build something that would surprise the Lego designer, right? It's not actually that many, really, or how many different kinds of pieces do you need, right? Um, so, um, so that's definitely been happening in Icebound when we've been testing it, which is awesome. So I think that really is going once the game is finally released. I think it's going to be a really good case for that technique as being something worth pursuing. Um, One of the challenges with that, though, especially again with sort of more mainstream games, is that it is really hard to do any kind of combinatorial or procedural text once voice acting has to be in the mix. So I've worked. I My sort of day job is as a PhD student in computer science at a lab in Santa Cruz that does research into games, which is pretty awesome.
We're both there.
Yeah, Jacob is also in that program. But one of the things we've done is we've actually done a couple collaborations now with Microsoft, looking at ways to get more cutting edge story tech into their games. And that's been one of the huge challenges with both of those projects is in sort of a AAA studio game, everything has to be voice acted. Not only that, it often has to be localized in half a dozen languages. So as soon as you start talking about wanting to do anything with like, stitching text together or having bits of text that change based on the current state of the game or anything like that, it's huge, red flags from that perspective, because it's like, well, how can you do that, right? So that's been, I think, a big barrier to story getting more complicated in games, is that sort of voice acting hurdle. And even a lot of indie games, now will have voice acting. So it's something that I think almost everyone has to consider. So do you want to talk maybe a little bit, Jacob, about what you think the future of that is?
Oh, well, yeah. I mean, I don't like it's sort of like one of those side things that you kind of check up on every now and again. But so like my sort of personal belief in some people disagree with me, but is that I think that the text to speech is actually going to be like within the next like 5 to 10 years or so is going to be at the point where you can sort of like have the profiles to be generating these audio assets on the fly from the different voice actors that have been doing it. And so I think my sort of personal belief about it is that procedural content generation for stories and dialogues, and having sort of like richly realized characters that can react to players is going to be possible with that sort of voice acting or things of that nature in the near future. And so for us, it's sort of like we want to be pushing at these systems with text while we are, while in the present, because in the future, that stuff will sort of be, I think, more easily achievable. And for me, too, I think the other thing that we've noticed is that, so Icebound has, combinatorial narrative and stories that are surprising even the writers. We're a team of 2 people, and we've been working on it for, I guess, like 2 years about right now.
Part-time.
part-time, and that's not a very big team. And the text, like if you took all of the text for Icebound, we haven't written, I know, what was it, like Meg for 80 Days, which is an awesome game that I would also recommend, wrote something like half a million words or something like that. So like in traditional sort of like branching narrative where it's like choose A or B, and I have totally authored A and I've totally authored B, those systems are really challenging because you have to write everything for every possible choice. And so with Icebound and other projects that Aaron has worked on and I've worked on, we've sort of tried to push at the idea of making the text flexible and more procedural as a way to like generate more text than you could if you just explicitly authored all the different things. And so I think with these sorts of systems, when the text to speech technology and sort of like building up voice profiles happens or gets to a place where that's believable and doesn't sound like you're talking to a telemarketer, that I think we're going to see that like there will be a sort of explosion of interest in these types of techniques because I think especially with like AAA games, and you see it with I think Shadows of Mordor or these other things, like it's getting all these awards and everything, and it was like it's so dynamic. The orcs are like living and breathing, and it's like, well, from a procedural standpoint, they're maybe not that complex, but what's telling is that that level of procedurality gets such a huge reaction from people. And so I feel like studios, both indie and sort of AAA, are going to that like this is going to be a big component of content in future game titles. So yeah.
So, and specifically what I wanted to bring this up because Jacob and I disagree about this, I think, a little bit. So if I'm stating your case correctly, I think what you think is within the next 5 or 10 years, text-to-speech technology will be good enough that it can replace some percentage of what is voice acted in games today. Is that right?
Yeah, totally. I think so. So I sort of like try out the different text-to-speech engines, and there was one that I saw that was using an approach where you built up a voice profile and then they could dynamically tag it to have it generating speech that sounded like your voice. And it was still, sort of like in early stages, but you could definitely tell when you listen to it on the side by side that it's like, oh, well, this is like, it almost sounds a little bit like, a little bit auto-tuney or maybe like a little bit of recording glitches in it, but it does sound like this person. And so when I saw that sort of stuff, I was like, yeah, we're close. And even if it wasn't, like, I think you could still do like a really engaging game, like Fallout 5, where everybody's wearing radiation suits, and so you can only communicate through these like muffled things with static. And so it's like, well, maybe the voice acting isn't quite there, but we've got static and all the other stuff, so nobody knows. But
right. And so, I mean, I would say I think there are definitely some voice acting in games that you could replace with text to speech without too much effort. Like, it's a pretty common trope to have, a computer voice or a robot or, even aliens or something you're talking to. But I really think even, voice acting in games gets ragged on a lot for pretty good reason, I think. But even I think bad acting is a lot better than what I see text-to-speech doing in, the near to medium term. Because I think there's so much more than just, pronouncing the words correctly and all of that kind of technical level stuff. Like even a bad actor is injecting into a line of dialogue kind of an emotional arc where like, you're going to stress this particular word a little more because you understand that that is setting up, a word 6 words later. That's like the payoff of that logical thought or that joke or whatever it is. So, I mean, I think even someone who's not an actor, who you get to just read a line off a script page, is going to be injecting so much sort of like context and human knowledge into it that I think it's going to be a long time before we see something that has any kind of emotional weight at all. So again, like maybe the computer voice or something, but that you could actually really replace in a game and have people think it was acceptable. So,
but
I guess we'll see.
But like nobody on this call has picked up that my audio files are being generated on the fly. I mean, I come across pretty natural, right?
Well, your CGI is a little weak, I think, but
I've heard that before.
Yeah. So and not every game obviously needs voice acting, and especially in the indie space, there are tons of games that are fine without it. Like 80 Days, like Jacob mentioned, won a lot of huge awards. I don't think that game would necessarily be improved by, having voice acting in it. So I think it's also fine to do, and Icebound doesn't have voice acting, I should say too. So I think it's fine. Obviously,
Yeah.
I would think this to not have voice acting in your game too, especially if you're doing a lot of stitching text together and interesting things like that. But it will be interesting to see if that's a barrier that those sort of wider games industry figures out how to cross anytime soon.
Could be like a AAA title, and you're trapped inside a haunted skyscraper, and you have to go in the different elevators to get to different floors. So you've got like combinatorial for the different elevators, but they only talk to you through the elevator like Muzak thing, and you just totally generate all of the stuff there. They're like, floor 3, you chose poorly.
Yeah. So yeah, so this sort of is hitting on another thing we wanted to talk about. So procedural content generation is, I think, getting more and more popular. It's safe to say you're seeing this come up more and more. Roguelikes have definitely kind of made a big resurgence in the last 5 years. There are games like Dwarf Fortress, which is slowly evolving towards presumably self-awareness or something on that level.
Yeah.
And No Man's Sky is pretty incredible and is entirely driven by procedural content generation. But you haven't really seen even very much in indie games these techniques applied to the story part of the experience, right? So definitely in things like Dwarf Fortress or No Man's Sky, the procedural content generation is being used to create a world in which it is possible for immersion stories to happen, right? Sort of, creating a stage on which stories can play out, or you can make your own stories or whatever. But actually using that technology to be generating in some way a story that's interesting for the player to go through is still something that hasn't been tried too seriously yet. Why do we think that is, Jacob?
So for me, I don't know, and like I could be totally off base here, but I sort of feel like, so the lure with procedural content generation and making these worlds, so like Spore was also like an earlier game that did this, and Dwarf Fortress certainly, is that you build up a really good simulation, and because the content is procedurally generated, you can actually have like a shitload of content that can change depending on what the players are doing or other variables, so it's flexible. And in some cases, that sort of seems like it's almost like the first hurdle is the temptation to say like that's enough, because in Dwarf Fortress, you like the community around that, like some of the most epic like stories I've seen have come out of these Dwarf Fortress playthroughs. But critically for the system has like all of the stuff in place to say like, when the monster in the bowels of your fortress wakes up, it's going to go on a rampage because of this, and then your dwarves are going to do that because of this, and then everything falls out. And when you look at the collection of events at the end of it, you're like, this is an amazing story. I can't wait to tell my friends about this. And so Dwarf Fortress is actually like really amazing at generating these sorts of player stories. But the sort of thing that I think you and I are kind of interested in is actually imagining something more like with drama managers, which for people maybe who are unfamiliar with the term is sort of like the idea of having the game listen to what the player is doing in the game and changing the game based on sort of preconceived notions of how their experience should be shaped, and sort of doing that. And an example that sort of like drives me a little bit crazy, or sort of brings up an early example of Left 4 Dead with the zombie fire hose, where it's like, you look like you don't have enough zombie. I'm going to give you some zombie. But that is an example of sort of like the game looking at the player's experience and saying like, you are below zombie quotient. Like we need to give you more zombie. There's another thing, I guess maybe it's incumbent upon us to mention. So like we're in a lab with Michael and Mateus, who did Facade, which sort of is an interesting thing, is an interesting game to sort of look at. And that very explicitly has a notion coded into the game of like there are dramatic moments and there's a progression of dramatic moments, which he calls beats, that when the player, you can interact by typing in text, and then the system can sort of like sort that text that you've typed in into different buckets. And that sort of approach actually is really good at giving sort of like giving the player the ability to feel like they're interacting very flexibly with the characters. And if you're interacting with them in a certain way and the game state is not in a place where the drama manager that's looking is saying like, okay, we need to ratchet up the tension, it will guide the NPC interactions to react to your stuff differently or to bring up different conversation topics to try to steer the player in the direction that it wants. And that sort of like coercion, I think, is what that we're kind of interested in.
And I think maybe too, it's useful to draw a distinction between like story sequencing and story generation, right? So I think a lot of things that use drama management, like Facade, are essentially using, computational smarts and cool algorithms to figure out the best possible order to present you with a bunch of, handwritten options. To sort of give you the best both worlds of, all of those were hand authored by humans who are good storytellers, hopefully. But the system can respond to the player's agency by sort of sequencing them in the best way for your particular playthrough, right? And I think that's a little bit of a different thing than pure procedural generation, right? And I think it's a bit of a fuzzy line between those things, but maybe one way you could divide those is saying that in procedural generation, there's no way a human could possibly have created all of those alternatives, right? So I don't know numbers, but No Man's Sky, has millions or billions or whatever it is of possible planets. So it's not a matter of like picking the best one from a bunch of planets that somebody has made already, right? It's about, literally the only way that you could have this experience is if these were being generated algorithmically. And so from story, right, that's the really hard thing, right? I think most of what you have seen is more along the sequencing lines.
Yeah. Because too, like a lot of that stuff comes down to sort of simulation thinking. So you've got like the simulationist approach, where it's like, I've defined physics. I've made a falling rock generator, and you can throw all sorts of throwing rocks at it. And it's like, look at how that rock just fell. That's amazing. Like I would have never thought that rock would have tumbled through the air just like that. But when you sort of start trying to apply it to stuff about story, which is like the meaning of the events, like what's the arc of this entire thing, and what does the player really need like in their story right now? That's actually a really tricky question. But it's an interesting thing to push at least.
Yeah. And most of the work that I do know of that's happened in this space has been kind of more research work, right? So coming out of like games academia. And a lot of that is really based on, you mentioned simulation, right? So the idea that there is something you can either simulate or sort of logically derive that equals a good story, right? So there's one of the sort of earliest attempts to do serious story generation that I know of at least was a project that dates back to the 70s called Tailspin. Not to be confused with the cartoon that dates back to the 80s called Tailspin. But the 70s Tailspin basically had the idea that it was simulating a simple world, and characters in that world would be generated with goals, and then it would be able to narrate those characters taking a series of actions that would result in them achieving their goals. And so the sort of the author of this, James Meehan, I think was his name, so. As a sort of a sample domain, had this sort of storybook world where there were all of these characters like, Bob the Bear and things like that.
It's like an Aesop's fable.
Yeah, sort of and so they would have sort of goals in the world, like Bob the Bear needed to get some honey, and another character had the honey but wanted something else from Bob the Bear. And the system, behind the scenes is essentially doing a bunch of math to figure out, like, logically, how can we get the story into the end state. And so Bob the bear would go ask his friend, the bird, for honey, but the friend wanted a favor first. Um, and it's interesting because the stories it generates are incredibly boring. I think maybe unsurprisingly. And I think maybe even, the author of this was not necessarily hoping to generate like a novel, fascinating story, right? I think it's more sort of a proof of concept project. But what's interesting and the thing that people actually remember most from that project is the sort of broken stories. So there was one sort of famous broken story where Bob the bear or somebody was trying to cross a river. So he got in the river and started swimming, and then gravity drowned. um, and so you read this output and you're like, oh, I think I sort of see what was happening there. Like gravity was like some agent that the system was using to simulate something, but it didn't understand that, this concept of drowning should not work on this, meta character or whatever. There's another sort of famous tailspin story that gets mentioned a lot and people writing about it, where the system basically goes into an infinite loop where man, how does this work? It's like Bob the bear asks his friend for honey, but the friend doesn't have honey, but he realizes that he can get a favor out of Bob if he has the honey. So he asks Bob the bear to bring him some honey so he can have the honey. And then Bob asks the friend to bring him some honey. So they just like go back and forth asking each other for the honey, like until, the heat death of the universe. So anyway, the point of this is that I don't actually know if logic and simulation are necessarily the right approaches to be generating a story, because I think the things that we find interesting about stories are actually the ways in which they differ from being the expected sort of outcomes of a set of interactions.
Well, there's also, I mean, so in direct contrast to this, like Icebound has no modeling of any of this. Like, there's very little simulation in Icebound. It's pretty much all of the logic and the code in it is based around like sequencing these different text fragments to pull them into alignment with each other such that they make a story. And so it's interesting because so like on one hand you have Tailspin, and it's like I need to simulate what a river looks like and what a how does gravity work? And oh no, I messed up, gravity drowned. Oh, okay, let's build in a simulation of gravity so it understands gravity. And there's a lot of people in the research community, I guess like Douglas Hofstadter is kind of one of these that's sort of like the computer must understand like what it means when it's manipulating these symbols. But for like Icebound, the system for Icebound has no idea that tables hold up objects or that you can't eat a lantern. Like there's nothing in there like that. But what it does know is the sort of like this segment of text has these sorts of properties, and I know that if I place this in conjunction with this other piece of text, that is good. And there's a lot of like tricky things about generating stories. And in Icebound, we sort of sidestepped a lot of these really hard problems that people just grind against for years trying to figure out by sort of saying like, we don't need to really worry about per se like simulating persistence of characters between text fragments per se. We need to get the right things so that the characters are present and the player understands, can fill in the gaps. So like an example of this would be like, if we have a text fragment where a character is in a dining room having a conversation with another character, and then another text fragment where those same two characters, one of them punches the other one in the mouth in the mechanics room or whatever, we don't have to model how did they get from the dining room to the mechanics room? Like, do we need to build in a simulation of like pathways and what's a valid path and all of this stuff? It's like, no, like we present the two text fragments and the readers understand like, well, they probably walked there, or this fragment happened sometime afterwards, maybe it was a day later or whatever. But those sorts of like little problems, I feel like is a lot of the stuff with the simulation approach that there's a lot of really tough problems to get around. And at the end of the day, even if you've solved those problems, you haven't yet tackled the problems of like, if Bob the bear swims the river, like why do we care about Bob swimming the river? Or like, is it good that he swims the river, or should he like rail at the river on the side, going, "No, my honey, one day, river." So yeah, so I think there's sort of like an interesting contrast in approaches that you can take for that.
And that I think that ties into one other thing too that is relevant is the more specific of a story you're trying to tell or generate, even the more the more you can essentially cheat, right? So Tailspin supposedly is a story generator that could tell any kind of story, right? It is like a generator for story. But one of the really interesting things that you see in the sort of indie tabletop role-playing community is over the last 10 years, the trend has really been towards systems that are about telling very specific kinds of stories, right? So, games like Fiasco and Microscope, Juggernaut is a new game I wanted to talk about in a second. Are for, I guess Microscope not so much, but a lot of these games are about telling stories that are in very specific settings, about very specific plot arcs. And the advantage of that is then you can get rid of a lot of the sort of stuff that you would need to tell any kind of story at all, right? So to tell a story about anything, I think you almost effectively have to be human, right? But it's easier to encode the rules for telling, like, a murder mystery where a set number of people are in a closed environment, like a house, and a set of things from a pretty limited palette of actions might conceivably happen to them, right? So those sort of restrictions get you closer towards doing this. And so I think actually one answer to like what's the future of interactive story games or interactive story is to look at tabletop story games, because essentially what so many of those are doing is replacing stuff that we can't do with computers yet, at least with people, right? So there are a ton of fascinating games coming out of that community.
Yeah, they're really it's really amazing. Like it's some of my favorite. Yeah, like because we played Polaris. And yeah, like going through that whole experience, I was just like, this is so great from like a mechanics standpoint, and yeah.
And if you're not familiar with Polaris, the central idea is that you're playing characters who are knights of this sort of dying race that lived at the North Pole in some mythic past. But the plot arc of the game is all set up that your civilization is dying and all of your characters are inevitably going to sort of fall into corruption and despair. So it's sort of like an interactive tragedy in contrast with something like Dungeons and Dragons, where you're the hero and you're going to win and everything, right? But the interesting thing about that is a bunch of the game mechanics are actually designed to give your character this sort of interesting journey down this path of decline.
Yeah. The thing that I really like a whole lot about that is, so you play with 4 people, and you have to sit like in a sort of cross. So you have someone across from you, to your left and to your right, and each person has a contextual role in relation to people around them. So like the person who sits across from you is always your antagonist, and it's totally freeform. So people can be making stuff up, like ridiculous stuff, like even so far, I think, is like saying like your character falls down the stairs and breaks both of their legs, and that can totally happen. But the thing for me that seems so interesting is that like it's so interesting to have players or these systems where someone is in opposition to you, but other people are in support of you, and everybody has the ability to create this story, and they have an understanding of like the kind of tension that needs to happen if they're good tabletop role players. And so the sort of interactions that you get that come out of that just really make interesting situations. Yeah. So.
So I guess one thing I should say too is we don't have the stream window open in the interest of trying to minimize conflicts with video and stuff. So if anyone in the chat has had questions, we haven't been ignoring you. We just did not see them. So if anything's popped up that you want to relay, or if you guys have questions for us, feel free to jump in.
Would you like us to go ahead and read them to you?
Yeah, sure. That'd be great.
There was one asking, what was it about? Where is it? Where is it? Where is it?
Where is Icebound right now? Icebound's iOS, iPad, and other iOS.
And PC.
Are you planning NPC with a webcam?
Yeah.
Is that being released over Steam or independently?
It'll be everything we can get it onto, hopefully. Yeah, we're really hoping it'll be on Steam. There's an interesting challenge for us because the book is required to play it. And we actually haven't we haven't talked to Steam since IndieCade when we were there, but Steam now does have like a distribution mechanic for sending out physical objects because they've got the controller and stuff like that coming up. So we're hoping there's some way we'll be able to piggyback on that. But we'll also just be selling it directly off our website, and we're partnering with
Indie Game Revolution.
Indie Press Revolution, or is that right? Yeah, IPR. Yeah. Which is a really great company that sells a lot of tabletop role-playing games by small companies and graphic novels and things like that. The book will also probably be on Amazon and places like that. So yeah, we have this interesting physical challenge that a lot of games don't have, but we're hoping the uniqueness of it will make people interested in kind of working with us to figure out a way to have it on their platforms. So.
Yeah, and the book, I guess, like if people aren't familiar, but the book is like an 80-page sort of full-color book. And the way it works is that it sort of has like all of this material. It's sort of, kind of mysterious, like all of this material that relates to the backstory of Chris, who's the main character in the game. And so like throughout the game, you're actually showing him pages from this book. At the very beginning of the game, so I'm not giving away any spoilers or whatever, but there's like this warning that says like, like you're not allowed to show this book to, like this is outlawed material or whatever. And so essentially what you're doing with this book is you're showing him and unlocking pieces of his past with it. And the augmented reality, which is when you have sort of like a physical thing and then a digital object that registers to it. So like you show it a page from this book, and it may play a movie clip, or it may change the like appearance of the page to unlock more information. But yeah, so that book's like 80 pages, and it's like Aaron said, you'll be able to get it off of Indie Press Revolution or Amazon. Yeah, and the way we structured it is the game is actually free, and you can download and actually play like the first part of the game. To a certain extent, and then Chris is sort of like, I've heard there's this book out there, like you need to find this book and show it to me. And so that's sort of how we're envisioning the rollout being.
That's kind of cool because it kind of gives you a little bit of it, almost like a demo.
Yeah.
One other question in chat, Evil Dog asked if Chris Crawford, or if you're familiar with Chris Crawford in your research.
Yeah, definitely. Yeah. I backed his Kickstarter that just failed, unfortunately.
Saboot.
Yeah, Chris's stuff is really fascinating. I think, so we were talking about simulation earlier and whether that's the right approach or not. I actually think to a certain extent, Chris Crawford makes a really good case that his approach to simulation is actually one that could potentially generate good stories. So, and I just sort of backed it, and I didn't really get into the details of his newest thing, so this might not be up to date with his most recent project. But as of a couple years ago, so he had released a game called Balance of Power 21st Century that was kind of a proof of concept for Erasmatron, I think. I'm trying to remember what it was called, circa 2009-ish. But it was sort of a remake of his 80s Balance of Power game. But one of his central ideas is giving both the player and the system a shared language, and having that language be complicated enough that both the player and the system can express interesting concepts with it. And then another part of that is the idea of letting you express concepts about other people's conceptions of concepts. So in Balance of Power 21K, it was all about being like playing a country kind of on the global stage, dealing with, negotiations and stuff like that. And, you could express things like, Russia's opinion of Britain's opinion of China or things like that, right? And that allowed for this sort of really complicated interactions to come forth. And so Balance of Power, that version of it, again, wasn't maybe necessarily a really interesting story by itself, but I think the kind of things Chris is doing is moving in the direction of that. So I really hope he's able to sort of like keep pursuing the things he's working on, because there's a lot of really the complexity, and then also the kind of nested layer of representations, I think, are both really powerful techniques.
Yeah.
So,
and it's an important too, like, Chris Crawford's also like super gutsy, right? Like, I think that's another thing that is why, and I think it's sort of changing with, the promulgation of the indies, is that a lot of the things with the AAA titles, there's so much that comes into play for like the economics of a game, or, QA, and all of this stuff that really is a dampening effect on some of these technologies that really, I feel like a lot of times with the AAA studios, and the larger the project is, there's so much riding on it that you get risk averse. And even in cases where, it's like Skyrim and all of those things, like there's bugs everywhere, like the bucket bug. And, I'm sure there are some studios that they would look at that and be like, this is terrible. We're never doing procedural buckets again. Look at what these players are doing with these awful buckets.
Skyrim ruined procedural buckets forever.
But, like, honestly, it was perfect, because it's like this hilarious bug. You wouldn't think it happens. It's delightful, right? Like, all of the players, you see all of these videos of people being like, put a bucket on his head, run away. And so I think that, I think that some people get it into their minds to not be ambitious with some of the things that we could be bringing to games. And one thing that I've always sort of admired about Chris is that he sort of has a like no holds barred approach to like, no, we have to go here. It's our responsibility. Like, maybe you're coming along or maybe you're not, but I'm going over here. So yeah,
he's very passionate, and he's also been working on this stuff for like 30 years or more now. So he is not someone to take lightly.
Yeah.
Got about 5 minutes. I got a question for you also. What challenges did you come across and overcome while dealing with augmented reality? Because I know when we talked to you a while ago on our show, on the Indie Game Riot podcast, you were saying like, oh man, it's been a trip because of all the challenges.
Yeah,
you want to talk about it, or?
We've had some new challenges since we were on the show. So working with any kind of cutting edge technology is always interesting, because things are changing really fast.
Or even like technology that lots of different companies want to make a lot of money off of, and everybody's trying to find their angle for doing that.
So recently, we use a library called Mateo for augmented reality, and recently they were acquired by Apple. And Apple kind of has a history of buying companies doing cool things and shutting down the cool things so that they can be relaunched or rebranded as Apple cool things. So like they did this with Siri a couple of years ago. And Jacob had Siri on his phone at that time, and then it stopped working because Apple was like,
you can't, this is not supported on this device anymore. And I was like, but Siri, we've grown close over these years, and
So now we're in this really interesting position of not knowing whether this sort of core part of our game is going to stop working at some point.
That's terrifying.
And to be clear, in case future listeners or current listeners are concerned, it's like there are other libraries out there, but especially for people like for Aaron and me who are doing this kind of part time, really, it's just sort of like, we have this library, we have it locked down, we know how it works, it's integrated into the game. It's going to be coming out fairly soon. And if at the very end we have to say like, oh, let's rip the guts out and put in this other library now because this library has gone away, it's just like a development treadmill of the worst parts of development that you don't want to be doing, which is like the technical troubleshooting.
And we've seen so many devs be like, oh, Unreal 4 is out, let's make the game Unreal 4, and it was like, early access on Steam, and then it disappears.
So we have our fingers crossed that things will be all right for us, but but yeah, it's a challenge, and we had issues. We might have talked about this when we were on the show. I forget exactly when that was, but right before we were going to go show the game at IndieCade, there was a software update that totally busted the game in a way. It was I don't want to rag on Apple per se, but Apple updated iOS in a way that broke the game, and they make it incredibly hard to downgrade to an older version of iOS. So we were like super scrambling to make our game even work, that had worked the day before to be able to show it to IndieCade. So
yeah, I think it was like I was up at my desk and my iPad popped up a little like boop, and it's like, hey, like latest version of iOS, you want to download? And I was like, had this like feeling, and I was like, yes, I do. What will it do to Icebound? And so I did, and then I started up the game. It actually tanked our animation system so badly that we thought it had frozen. But it hadn't. It was just that the frame rate had dropped to like a frame every 5 seconds or something. And so we're sitting there, and you guys have seen Icebound. We've got state of the art animation. It's like glowing circles.
Yeah.
You can drag around the glowing circles. So we had to go in, and we actually had to do some like last minute tweaks to it, and we got it working again, but. It's the development treadmill where you release something, you've worked hard on it, it works, and then you come back a month or two later, and it's like, oh yeah, that thing you made, it doesn't work anymore. Like, keep doing it. So, yeah.
Yeah, and part of this is our fault because we're the game is, it uses this third-party library, but the core engine is totally kind of like our own thing because we had specific requirements we needed to have. So if we were working with Unity or something, then we could at least share the burden of maybe there would be a couple hundred other people on the forums who are having the same problem as us.
We could use that combinatorial narrative engine.
Yeah, right. So so this is sort of the danger of when you're working with new stuff like weird combinatorial story or augmented reality is, and you have a really small team. Part of the reason it's taken Icebound so long is because of the times that we get sucked into these like technical, miasmas and have to waste, burn a week digging out of some, some tech hole.
And I think, it's probably a story for all game dev in a way, but it is frustrating when it's something you want bugs. The longer time you spend trying to fix a bug, the more epic a bug you wish it were that you were solving. So like the fact that, it took a week to fix a bug that's like, hey, this text is wrong, is sort of frustrating because you want it to be like, this is making iPads explode, like burst into flames across America. You must fix this bug. But in the end, it's like, boop. So, yeah.
Awesome. Thank you guys for coming on and doing this panel.
Yeah,
super interesting.
Another freaking game I am so excited for.
Yeah.
Awesome.
Your excitement excites us.
Yeah, and
Man, they're just boners popping everywhere.
Cool. And it's coming out. It should be coming out fall at this point. The book is now like at the printers, starting to go through that process of being turned into a physical object. So that's fantastic.
It's crazy to think that was probably the easy part. It's just like, we have to deal with publishers and a printer, and like that's awful on a normal day, but
yeah. So that was really great to get that part done.
Yeah.
But yeah, you can pre-order it, ice-bound.com, and we have a dev blog on there too, where we occasionally will write about Icebound, but also the kind of stuff we've been talking about today. So if anyone listening is interested in that, check that out.
Yeah,
awesome, guys. Thanks.
Awesome. Thank you so much.
Cool. Thanks for having us.
Yeah, it's great.